Hello, I'm Jungwon. I'm one of the co-founders of Elicit, and I haven't recorded a video in a while because I actually had a baby, which was amazing. The reason I'm here today is to tell you about Elicit Systematic Reviews. This is now one of the most popular workflows in Elicit. It's one of our most popular videos, and over the last few months, our team has been working really hard to automate this entire systematic review process from beginning to end. So Elicit now supports search, screening, data extraction, and even a bit of report writing. This is going to be a big video. There's a lot to cover. I'm not following any YouTube best practices. We are just going to systematic review here. I'm going to walk you through in a lot of detail how you can use Elicit to automate your systematic reviews and hopefully save an insane amount of time so that you can spend more time looking at the results and thinking critically about the findings. Before we get started, what I'll cover today is, starting at the very beginning, how Elicit will help you refine your research question for the systematic review, how you can collect papers from your Elicit library, papers that you upload using traditional search, or using Elicit Search, how you can define screening criteria and narrow down your broad universe of papers into the ones that are screened in, how you can define extraction fields, and then how you can generate a first draft of a report, all in Elicit. I hope what you'll see is that this is going to be pretty different from any other AI tool. We've really tried to make it very transparent. It's going to be automation first, but you will always be able to step in and evaluate the work that the AI systems are doing very easily. Everything will be directly linked to quotes from the underlying text, and you'll be able to make any changes that you want. So we're really trying to give you a lot of power and control and transparency, and I think that's really quite different from all the other products out there. Our hope is that by significantly automating systematic review, we'll be able to give researchers a much better understanding of the state of science on a given topic, as well as help people who are trying to make evidence-backed decisions. All right, so let's get started. On the homepage, you'll see Start a Systematic Review. We're really targeting this for people who are familiar with systematic review. It can be a bit overwhelming for people who haven't done a systematic review before or know about the different steps in it. So very much recommend this for pro and power users who know how a systematic review is done and are familiar with all the steps. The first thing you'll do, like you do everywhere else in Elicit, is ask a research question. We can start with something broad, maybe like microplastics and pregnancy. One of the new things that we've introduced is feedback on your research question, so that when you are not really sure where to get started, we'll give you suggestions. This is actually really important because this research question is going to drive everything else that happens later in the process. Now, we want you to spend a little bit of time and make sure that your research question is as clear as it can be. And asking the right question is really half the battle, right? So I think it's an important moment to figure out exactly what you're looking for and what you're not looking for. In this case, I intentionally started with something really vague and underdefined, and Elicit will suggest things like specifying the research focus. When you hover over these suggestions, you'll immediately see what some alternatives could look like. Elicit can make suggestions like, what is the association between maternal exposure to microplastics during pregnancy and adverse birth outcomes? How do microplastic concentrations in maternal blood correlate with fetal development markers during pregnancy? What are the potential risks of microplastic exposure for pregnant women in urban versus rural environments? So it's saying, suggest making the population more specific, suggest being more specific about how you're measuring outcome. I think this one's fine. I'll select that one. Even if you don't end up liking the exact questions, I think it can point out for you where things might be underspecified, where you might actually have more assumptions that you didn't make explicit. So once I have my research question, I'm going to proceed. You can see here that this setting is checked, populate steps with suggestions based on research question. So by default, Elicit is going to, at every point in time, make automated AI-generated recommendations for you. If you want to go through the process totally manually, you can just uncheck that. But we recommend getting a first draft of everything with AI because that will save you time and give you a sense of how you should be working with Elicit. So now if I run this, the first step I get to is the gather step, or the place where you pick all of your paper sources. Before I jump into this step, maybe I'll just give you a quick overview of everything that's going to happen. The first thing you'll see my research question is up here. I just clicked into this menu, drop-down menu. The first step is going to be defining our paper sources, collecting all of my papers that I want to include in the review. Then I'm going to define my screening criteria. Once I iterate on my screening criteria, I will run that over my full set of papers and get the recommendations for which papers should be screened in versus screened out. Then I'll work on defining my data extraction fields, really iterating on what information I'm trying to get from the papers. I'll apply that to all the papers that have been screened in. And then the last step is generating a research report. So these are the steps that we're going to go through that this systematic review workflow supports. We'll go through them one by one. So this first step is collecting all of the different papers. And there are 3 different ways you can bring papers into Elicit. All of the papers that you choose for the review will show up here. So one way you can bring in papers is from Elicit Search. So if I see suggestions, there are about up to 500 papers that I can bring to my review automatically. The Elicit Search here is using semantic search. We are looking at over 126 million papers from the Semantic Scholar database. We're looking at your research question, and we're saying based on the title and abstract of these 126 million papers, what are the top 100 most relevant ones, most similar in meaning? This is the same search that's used everywhere in Elicit, so if you're familiar with how that works, the same thing is happening here. Except one thing that's different is now you can bring in 500 papers at once as opposed to just looking at, say, the top 8, which is what was possible before. So I'm going to add 500 papers here. If I want to add more, I can select more from my library, and I can find papers. I can use my tags and import papers that meet a certain tag. I don't have any that are particular to microplastics, so I will not add any from my library. And then you can upload PDFs, drag and drop, or select this and open up a file picker. So at this point, we encourage you to bring in a lot of papers. You don't have to worry too much about which of the 500 from Elicit Search that you bring in, because we're going to do an explicit screening step afterwards. So we think it's easiest to just bring in all 500, and then we'll filter out the irrelevant papers later. We also recommend, if you're doing a formal systematic review for publication or for some type of regulatory filing, right now, I think the standard is still to do something that's not AI-based. A lot of systematic review search methods are still mostly focused on defining Boolean search strings and running them on PubMed, for example. And so you may still need to comply with that, in which case you can just do whatever you're used to doing, just run your traditional search methods, download those papers, bring them into Elicit, and then think of Elicit Search as just a supplement to make sure you haven't missed anything, because obviously traditional and keyword-based search methods are also pretty limited, and it's very common for people to find papers with Elicit Search that they couldn't find using any other approach. So you don't have to worry about, is Elicit Search better or equal to what you're already doing? You can do what you're already doing and then just add additional comprehensiveness on top of that. So it should be just strictly better for you. And if you want, you can click into any of these papers and see the abstracts. You can also see them on the side panel here. We are working on making it possible for you to import papers via CSV and RIS files, because we know it's hard to track down all of the PDFs, but right now it's still PDF-based. The next step here is to then define your screening criteria. And you'll see, you immediately get a bunch of suggested columns. So these are now custom generated based on your research questions. It's very specific to your project. These are not predefined fields that show up for every single query. These are really custom written for your specific review. And you can see that Elicit will just automatically start running these. So the approach here is automation by default. You don't have to put in a lot of work if you don't want to, but at any point you can take over. And that's how we strike the balance between saving you a lot of time, but giving you a lot of control and precision and transparency. Let's look at some of these suggested columns. You can click into any of them and see what Elicit thought was a relevant screening question here. So here's one that Elicit generated called exposure assessment. Does the study measure direct maternal exposure rather than only environmental microplastic levels? You can decide if that screening criteria is relevant for you. You can also change it if you would like. So let's look at another one. Exposure measurement. Does the study include quantitative measurement of direct maternal microplastic exposure through any route? And do we only want to look at studies that have some kind of quantitative measure? If you agree with it, you can leave it on. If you disagree, you can just toggle that off, and that will no longer be a screening criteria. So it's very easy to look at some of Elicit's suggestions and then decide whether you want them or not. Some other ones is a study conducted in humans as opposed to animals. Does a study report at least one birth outcome? Does it include pregnant women as participants? What's the study design? What's the study type? So these are probably going to be pretty helpful, but again, you can turn them off and you can change them. Is a study done something other than a case report or case series? I don't know, is the study design a randomized controlled trial? And it's pretty easy to update. And you'll see that will automatic. One of the benefits of automation is that it just saves you time and money. But I think another benefit is that it really enables you to work differently. Because the reality is, even if you are very careful about defining your screening criteria up front, you need to adjust it based on what the literature actually says, right? So I think having something that's a lot more iterative is powerful, whereas if you're doing it manually, you have to set it all right up front. You can run it once. You can't really go back and change it without significantly slowing down the project and making it very expensive. So you can see these just populate in real time. I'm actually just going to delete this and get rid of that screening criteria. You can easily add your own too. So again, if you don't like any of the AI suggestions, you don't have to take them. If you already have a really well-defined protocol, then you can just implement that here. You can ignore all of these. So if you have a criteria like region, did the study take place in the US? You can just add that column and that will automatically update. At this stage, we are actually just looking at a randomly selected sample of 100 papers. So this is not your full paper set. This is a representative sample that is smaller, designed to help you iterate quickly. So if you don't see a specific paper here, this is because it's just a subset of your papers. But it would be very expensive and slow to iterate on your entire set, which is why we start with just a small sample. Now, so what you see here is every single row is a paper. You can click on it again to see the abstracts, and each of our screening criteria are going across the top, right? And for every judgment, you can see why Elicit thinks this paper meets this specific screening criteria. So for population, it says, yes, it includes pregnant women, and you can very easily check that against the abstract. So if you're just used to reviewing a lot of abstracts really quickly, you're maybe a little bit uncomfortable with using AI, you can still do that here. If you want, you can still do it all manually. The information is here for you, and you can just navigate with your arrow keys to go through them really quickly. There will be some maybes, and you can see why it discusses placental transfer and fetal effects, but it's not explicitly talking about pregnant women, and it came from experimental models. So maybe this is on the fence. Here's a clear no. This is a narrative review instead of a meta-analysis. So we'll tell you in a lot of detail an evaluation of every single paper against every single screening criteria. We'll answer with yes, no, maybes, and we'll provide explanations for why that individual decision was made. The goal of this step is really to refine your screening criteria, again, to try it on a sample of papers, see what the papers say. Are there specific cases that you hadn't thought of? Do you want to edit those screening criteria? Once you are happy with your screening criteria, you can then go to evaluate screening. And now what this will do is run that screening criteria on the full set of 500 papers. So we just experimented on a set of 100, right? So now we're going to run it on the remaining 500. The papers are ranked by default in terms of likelihood of being included. So the papers you should most likely include based on your screening criteria are going to be at the top, and the papers that are least relevant, that least fit your screening criteria, will be at the bottom. And this is a rough illustrative score for approximately how relevant it is. And so for each paper, you can see whether or not we recommend including it. And there's an explanation here, a summary of the paper and how it meets the different criteria. And then you can also expand it and say, for every single one of my screening criteria, how did this paper meet that criteria? And again, if you click into it, you can see the abstract here. So if you're just used to going through a bunch of abstracts, you can just click into these, review the abstracts, and just go through them that way. If you are, again, not confident in the overall AI recommendation, then you can just think about this as a workflow accelerant. We've just organized all the papers in a ranking, most likely to include, starting with the most likely to include at the top, and you can just go through and do it manually if you prefer. You can override any decision that you want. So if you read the abstract yourself and decide this is not, you don't want to include it, then you can manually, again, take control and override. So basically what I recommend you doing at this point is starting at the top of the list, looking through some of these, making sure Elicit made the right choice and including the papers. And typically the ones at the top are going to meet all of your screening criteria. And then I think the next thing for you to do is figure out, okay, which papers are on the fence? Which papers did Elicit exclude? And do you agree with those judgments? Was Elicit too strict? Do you actually not care that much about quantitative exposure measurements? So come down to maybe the top of the highest ranking excludes and see if you want to actually override that decision and include them. Screening in Elicit is still currently just based on title and abstract, even though you're uploading the PDFs. We're working on ways to help you just import abstracts directly from CSVs or RIS files so that you don't have to track down the PDFs of every single paper that you want to screen. Once you're done, you'll actually be able to export the results as a CSV. So you can always export intermediate results. If all you want to do is screening, actually just abstract screening, you don't care about extraction, you can do that. You can export the results. You can do further analysis on your own. If you decide, having looked at this, that actually you want to make changes to the screening criteria, you go back to the screening criteria step and make those changes. So we've really designed it so that you're always iterating on a subset of the papers. And then once you're confident with those criteria, then you run on the full set. But at the point where you're running on the full set, this is not where the iteration is happening, except for manual overrides. So if you get here and you want to make some changes, you can easily go back and do that. If, having reviewed all this, you realize, oh, you missed a criteria, or actually your criteria were too strict or too loose, you can very easily go back to the screening criteria step and continue adding or changing your criteria here. This is really the space where you make all the changes. At the screening recommendation step, the only changes you're making are individual one-off overrides, not criteria level changes. And then if we're happy with the papers we've screened it looks like we're screening in 29 out of 500. We can move on to extraction. And similarly with screening, we start with a subset of our papers, just a sample, again, to make it faster to iterate on the definitions of the fields we want to extract. So we'll just see a sample here. Elicit is again automatically generating all the different criteria that it thinks are relevant to answering this research question. It's going to be pretty standard PICO stuff, but again, it's always customized to your research question. Here, the instructions, these are, again, automatically generated, and they're a lot more detailed. So study design, identify the specific type of study design, look in the methods section, look for type of study, give some examples. Here's some details about what to do if it's not clearly specified. So again, you can customize these. And if you don't need this information, you can just very easily remove it. Same thing with participant characteristics. Just a lot of detail, microplastic exposure assessment. One of the things, even if this doesn't end up being the information that you want to extract, or you already have fairly well-defined extraction definitions and criteria, I think this is a really helpful way of getting started in Elicit and knowing how to define these fields, how to prompt the system so that you're not starting from scratch. It conveys some of the best practices we've learned in getting good answers from the papers. By default, many of them ask for free-form answers, but you can have it select from a set of predefined fields. You can also have it answer yes, no, maybe questions. And all of my saved columns from all of the other work I've done everywhere else in Elicit are here, so I can always just use those as well. Again, it's pretty important to us that you be able to check all of the information in Elicit. Every single thing that's AI generated, we want it to be one click away from the ground truth, what's actually stated in the papers. So anytime you see an asterisk, if you click on that, you'll see direct quotes from the paper. You'll also see an explanation, because sometimes just reading the quotes it's a little bit hard to understand out of context. So you can tap through the relevant quotes in the paper. If we're getting information from tables, you'll see that cited. And then the explanation down here is also really helpful for understanding where Elicit might have misunderstood you, where your definitions might have been a little bit underspecified. It's very easy to add a new column here if you want to extract a custom field that Elicit didn't automatically suggest. And you can also search the table for specific answers, like maybe something related to standard deviation or like a specific author. As the tables get larger, this becomes more important. All right, if we're happy with our extraction set, then we can run it on the full set of papers. Your plan comes with a specific number of papers every single month that you can use for data extraction. We actually don't charge you at all for screening. We're only going to charge you for data extraction. So this is just going to confirm that it's going to extract the total number of papers. So now it'll run our extraction criteria on the remaining papers here. Once it's done, you'll be able to download it as a CSV. And if you have a particularly large table, again, you can search it for specific papers or specific information. We can currently support about 3,000 cells, so about 300 papers and 10 columns. This is a step that typically takes a very long time. With a lot of the teams we've been working with, we're able to save them something like 6 weeks that it would normally have taken them, and then they're able to use that time to spend working more closely with their clients if they're a consulting firm, or really looking at the data and thinking about where they want to go deeper. So our hope is that by saving you this time, you can really reallocate your time on thinking much more critically about what are the right questions to ask and what does all this data mean. From here, you can go back to any of the earlier steps and make changes. So you really don't have to worry too much about each step. It's very easy to come back and make changes. It's really quite different from doing the work manually. You can jump around as you need to. But similarly to screening, all of the editing is really supposed to happen at this extraction definition step. And then once you get to extraction results, it's really just populating everything. So if you want to go back and change something, you would go back one step to do that. Great. And then the last thing is the ability to generate a report based on all of this information. So the report is designed to summarize all the different studies that were found in the systematic review. You can think of it as a different way to understand all of the underlying data that you've been curating and extracting and screening. You can think of it as a first draft for a report that you're writing or a review that you're writing. It's not really ready to be a standalone systematic review, but it's designed to be an input into your workflow. I'll do a separate video going into a lot more detail on reports, but you can see it's populating here. In the meantime, I can show you some other things. You can share this review. If you're on our team or enterprise plan, you can actually edit this in real time. So you and a collaborator can have the screen open at the same time and make changes in real time, and it'll sync. So you can invite people to collaborate in this review, or you can just share it. And anyone else can look at it and check your work or understand all the steps that you went through. This will continue to run even as you navigate away, so you don't have to keep your browser open. It's going to keep doing work for you while you go and do other things. You can download the results of every single step. You can always go back and edit it. I think, again, that's like really the benefit. One of the frustrations people feel about doing manual systematic reviews is even when you've defined a really good protocol, you have to start from scratch every single time you want to make an update. And you spend so much time putting together a really good systematic review, but it takes so long. It's almost certainly going to be outdated by the time it's published. And then if you want to update it, you really have to start from scratch. You can't build on the work that you've done in the past. But now, if we digitize it like this, you can always come back, go back to paper sources, and easily add more papers. And then you already have your screening criteria defined. You already have your extraction fields defined. Any new papers you upload will just flow right through. It's going to take seconds once you have the new papers. So we think that's really powerful, and we're really excited about getting to living reviews that will just automatically update once a paper that meets all the criteria comes out. Okay, great. So this report has loaded. Our research question is at the top. There's a one-liner summary here, a detailed abstract summarizing all of the different studies, method section that takes a Prisma-inspired diagram showing how we evaluated the papers along all the different screening criteria, how we defined all the data extraction fields, and then summaries of all the different papers that we looked at. You can expand it to see all the different papers, an initial summary of all the papers here, the study design, all of the kind of columns that we defined here, and then a detailed discussion of all the different studies. This helps you understand the themes across the literature, maybe take a first draft, cluster some of the papers, and provide a first draft of the review that you will eventually end up writing. You can actually chat with the report and any of the underlying data that went into it. So if you want to ask follow-up questions about a specific paper, if you want to analyze things in a slightly different way, you can do that with the chat as well. There's a references list at the bottom, and you can download this as a PDF, which people have been really excited about. You can also share this report itself too with people here and here. So Elicit now supports all of the major and most time-consuming steps of a systematic review. You can automatically add up to 500 papers from Elicit Search. If you want, you can just use those papers, although we typically recommend using those as a supplement for any existing search methods that you have. You can use AI to screen all of your papers. You can iterate really quickly on your screening criteria. You can run them on all of your papers. You can look at detailed explanations for every single paper along every single criteria. You can manually override any paper whose screening judgment you don't agree with. You can look at all of the papers ranked by likelihood of being included. You can very quickly iterate on data extraction. Elicit extracts data from tables. It can extract really detailed quantitative data. And now you can even generate a report to use as a first draft or as a different synthesis on the data as you think about what all of the findings mean. You can export the information along every single point in the process. You can go back and change anything in the review. You can easily update the review with new papers, and you can collaborate with the rest of your team on this review as well. So we're really excited. I think there's just a lot to this new workflow. I'm really hoping it can save you a lot of time, and I'm hoping that with AI, we can summarize the state of science much more quickly so that we can make more evidence-backed policies and really avoid recreating the wheel or missing out on incredible opportunities because we didn't know about a particular research domain. With Elicit, you'll notice that things are very transparent. You'll know exactly what each of the steps look like. You know exactly why every single decision was made. Every AI-generated answer has direct links to the underlying text. I hope you appreciate that. This is really built for power users who care a lot about scale, care a lot about accuracy, care a lot about transparency. That's what this workflow is designed to support. We'll have a few more updates for you in the next week or so that I'm also excited to share. But in the meantime, I hope we're really able to help you a lot with your systematic reviews.